Welcome to the Norman Rockwell Museum. It's wonderful to have you with us. My name is Stephanie Plunkett. I'm Deputy Director and Chief Curator, and we have a wonderful evening for you with Maureen Hickey. But before I introduce Maureen and tell you a little bit more about her and the program, I'd just like to say that we're very fortunate to have a number of our board members and National Council members in the audience this evening, and I'd love to have you stand if you wouldn't mind. We have Rob Babcock here, Marion Razor, Dave Klausmeyer, and I think Audrey Friedner is here. Hi, good, oh, wonderful, thank you. And our director, Lori Norton-Moffat. So we have this great leadership of the Norman Rockwell Museum, and we're happy you're here. Thank you. I began speaking with Maureen about this program last summer because she came to the museum and she said, "What are you going to be doing next summer?" And what I was excited to talk with her about was the fact that we were preparing this exhibition, Inventing America, that actually compares the work of two important visual communicators, Norman Rockwell and Andy Warhol, and I think we'd be hard-pressed to find people who have been more influential than they have. So Maureen came up with a fascinating topic for a talk, and I'll first tell you a little bit about Maureen, who is incredibly accomplished, and then just a little bit about what she's going to be speaking on tonight. Maureen Hickey is an accomplished art historian and educator who has been a resident of the Berkshires for many years. She served as curator of education at the Berkshire Museum for 11 years, from 1980 to 1991, where she organized many outstanding educational exhibitions and related programs focusing on American history and the heritage of the region through and relating to the visual arts. Some of Maureen's many exhibitions included Looking Back, 19th Century America as seen through prints of Currier and Ives, Berkshire County, Its Art and Culture, 1740 to 1899, and A Return to Arcadia, Berkshire County Landscapes. Return to Arcadia was accompanied a beautiful and well-researched exhibition which appeared at the Berkshire Museum and then traveled to the New Britain Museum of American Art in Connecticut. Her book, titled A Walk in the Country, Innis and the Berkshires, provided the first examination of the Berkshire paintings of George Innis, one of our most acclaimed American artists of the 19th century, and that accompanied an exhibition at the Sterling and Francine Clark Art Institute in Williamstown. For Maureen, and this I think is one of the most inspirational aspects of the way that she has curated and created educational programs, she believes that art and architecture embody the culture, history, politics, and spirituality of the time in which they were created, so that they're real reflectors on who we are and who we have been. Coming of Age, American Portraits from Copley to Warhol, which is her program this evening, will present a very interesting link between portraits of the past and portraits of the present, but with the focus on leading to Andy Warhol's work of many noted celebrities and other individuals. So I think showing the progression of what portraiture has meant to us and how they reflect the people of our times and the times of the past. So we're so happy to have Maureen with us. We're so happy to have all of you here. Please help me to welcome Maureen Hickey.
Well, thank you, Stephanie. Stephanie asked me to do this, so I did what she said. I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank my daughter, who could not be here tonight, who, thank God, is a technology expert, who helped me with the PowerPoint and get the photos off the computer, which is really a fet. So, and I'm going to talk about, as Stephanie just said, I'm going to talk about art as history, or art is history. Because if you go back to the Greeks, the Egyptians, all the art up to until this time really does embody the culture, the spirituality, religion, so forth of the age. So if you learn to look at art and understand what the artists are doing and that they do reflect their time, that is what I want you to go away with tonight. So I'm going to start. I hope I do this okay. I'm supposed to point this at that. Okay. So I'm going to start with Egyptian art, my Serenus and his wife, and Andy Warhol with Marilyn Monroe. So I'm going to talk about how the Egyptians, as you know, their whole philosophy and religious was that they were going to live forever, and everything was in preparation for death. And so you have the pyramids, you have the embalming, but their soul was going to go into the Ka figure, and their soul was going to go under the Nile to Everland. So everything that was done by the Egyptians, their building, their religion, their belief in the sky gods, directed their life. And Mycerinus was one of the most important pharaohs of the Egyptians. And what I really want you to look at is the way in which he's depicted. He was very powerful. He was the son of Horus, who he and Ra were the kings of the sky. And they had a canon, in other words, a structure in which they would do their portraits. And also, I want you to notice that these are of stone, that they worked in stone. If you go to Egypt and you go into some of the tombs, like we went into Nefertiti's that day, and I almost cried when I saw the frescoes, but they do a lot of frescoes in paragraphs, and they're wonderful. And those are of more watercolors, watercolor paints. But Mycerinus, if you note, the head is a certain measure of the body. The body is very abstract, muscular. Notice his hands are clenched with rods in them. The rods were the significance of his power. Notice his left foot is always forward, and he's standing very upright, and he has on they always wore a beard, which they tied on, the pharaohs, and his pharaoh hat. And Mycerina, her significance there is that she's taking care of him. She has her hand on his arm. But notice that it's really quite abstract. And I want to compare it with Andy Warhol. And we have an icon of our century as well. And she is very influential as well. And this is by Andy Warhol, and that is a photo that he then silk screened onto canvas. And I was just reading an article in the Globe that I was giving to my friends here about the fact that Andy Warhol was raised a Roman Catholic, and he loved the paintings in church, he loved the religious icons. So this critic said, well, and these are his religious icons, doing all the celebrities. So that's pretty interesting. I'm going to talk about what is a portrait. This is a portrait of Rembrandt, self-portrait, and then Gilbert Stuart, who's one of our finest 1800s, 19th century artists, of George Washington. Rembrandt, the definition of a portrait is it's the most characteristic part of a person's soul and mind. And you can see in Rembrandt that he's old, he's sort of disillusioned, he's tired. And then you see how Stuart highlighted George Washington's forehead to show his wisdom, his dignity, and it's a timeless type of portrait. It will never age, it will just stay as it is. And that's on your dollar bill, by the way. Then I want to go back to the Greeks. Now, I don't know whether you realize that when the Egyptians were fighting in the Middle East, they hired Greek mercenaries to be their soldiers. And a lot of them lived in the Delta, and while they were there, they saw the Greeks saw the Egyptian temples, which are humongous. They saw their statues that were humongous. And they went home, and after Crete was wiped out by the tidal wave and began to develop their own art, guess what they took it from? They took right from the Egyptians. This is a Kyros figure. Now, let me tell you a little bit about the Greeks. They believed in Mount Olympus, and Mount Olympus is where all the gods lived. And the Olympics started because the Greeks themselves wanted to become superstars. and they were hoping to maybe get into Mount Olympus as one of the superstars. But they have the same canon as the Egyptians. Look, the left foot is forward, the hands are clenched, upright, and the face is staring. A Kuros figure, these were great athletes that they put up. Sometimes they were also grave markers. And this is how the temple to Athena in the Parthenon, on the Acropolis, this is how she looked. And you do know that Athena was born from the head of Zeus. Did you hear about that? Well, what happened is Zeus was quite a lover. And Hera, his wife, was very jealous of him and jealous of these women. So when she found out that this one goddess was pregnant, and Zeus was very afraid what was going to happen, he went over and took Athena out of her womb and put her in his head. So Athena is the goddess of wisdom and just wars, and that is why she's the goddess of wisdom. But if you notice, I haven't seen, this is just a mock-up, but her left leg would have been forward as well, frontal, and of course the Greek temples were very much copied from the Egyptian temples. And then we get to Rome, and this is a statue of Caesar Augustus when he was young, and I want you to know he never got any older. Wasn't he lucky? And that's Alexander, who traveled all over and captured many countries. Notice that the Romans, when they captured Greece, they took the prizes of the Greek statues home and put them in their villa gardens. And Caesar Augustus, notice the left leg now, what the Romans did was make the left leg bend, so he's moving a little bit. His head is not frontal, it's to the right, and the arm is raised in power. And it's a beautiful statue. I've seen the original. And this is Alexander, who was in the Hellenistic period of Roman art. And you can see also the left knee is bent. They're all copying the original Greek statues. And then as the empire, as we all know, became less of a republic and more of a dictatorship, Vespasian, who was a Flavian, one of the Flavian family rulers, wanted to go back to the original concept of a republic, and he wanted to be shown as a hard-working Republican. And he's a very realistic now, not idealistic portrait. And then this fella, who looks like a monster, doesn't he? He was one of the last emperors, Caracalla. He was the one that was killing all the Christians. This is after Christianity was in fact. He was very decadent, he was cruel, and whoever did this portrait of him really caught his character, didn't they? He's just a comparative Vespasian who was a very hardworking Republican. Now, in 313, Constantine created Constantinople, and he also made Christianity the state religion. And this is a very colossal statue of him, but his eyes are really looking up to the heavens, and he became a Christian himself. And this is Justinian, who was over in the eastern part of the church in Constantinople. And if you go down to the apse, on either side are these glass mosaics of Justinian. On the other side is his wife Theodora, and they're bringing offerings into the altar. But there was an iconoclastic controversy in the church that because the first Christians were mostly Jews and Muslims who did not believe in images of God or the saints or whatever, they wanted to stay with very flat, abstract, spiritual. The eyes are staring at you. There's no, they're supposed to be something like a Russian icon. Whereas the iconic Phyllis wanted to, influence Giotto, who was one of the most important painters in Italy in the 1300s. And Giotto was, the beginning of the Renaissance was starting, and Giotto wanted to make the figures of the Madonna and Child very realistic. He my professor said she's like a big fat Italian mama, sitting there with her baby, and then of course the saints and so forth are much smaller, and she's in a throne, so we're now getting into three-dimensionality. Whereas Simone Martini, who was from Siena, Giotto was Florence, Simone Martini was from Siena, he still wanted to go the old way. You can see how flat the Madonna is, face is rather green, she looks rather like another Russian icon. And the gold was a symbol of holiness, as was the halo. So this is the beginning of the Renaissance. The Renaissance really, really changed the world of art and the world of literature and the world of philosophy. And when you think of Raphael, he was right in the middle. You had the Medicis, who were very literate, who were very aware of the classics, and you had the church. And who were the patrons of art? The patrons of the art were the church and the Medicis. So this is Raphael, and it's a very realistic portrait of Julius as a pope. He looks absolutely exhausted, very pensive, very maybe disappointed. And then, I wish you could see this a little larger, but this is the School of Athens, because as the Renaissance was coming in, they wanted to, this is in the Vatican, and on your left at the back, I'm supposed to be using this pointer, I hope it works. On the left in the back is Plato and Socrates, and these are their students. They're teaching the classic, and look at the building, it's very classic and Renaissance. With the perception and the perspective going straight back, and look at the beautiful statues. And this is all in a fresco, by the way, in the Vatican. He did the whole library there. And then Michelangelo was not an iconoclast. He wanted to make Christ, God, and everyone just beautiful. So this is in the Vatican, the Sistine Chapel. We now have a picture of God. And that's never been shown before. That was never done before. And this is creation, and that is Adam. And you can see how they're going right back to the classical style. And this is in the Academy in Florence. This is David. And Michelangelo thought that the human body was the most beautiful thing to be celebrated. And look at the left knee is thing, but he's like Augustus. He's pointing, looking to the left, and he has one arm up. So he's more human and more alive. And then we have Leonardo da Vinci, and we all think of him with the Last Supper, but secularism is really coming in now, and you've all seen pictures of the Mona Lisa, and this is Genevieve da Vinci on the right. And they were beautiful. This is a real portrait. I don't know, this seems to be more of a psychological portrait, his ideal beauty. But notice now that we're getting landscapes. We're not talking religion here. We're talking psychological beauty. I mean, she's an enigma to you. And this woman is a beautiful, pale-skinned. And look at the landscape behind. So we're now getting back to earth here. And then we're going now to Holland and Flanders, or Belgium, and we have Jan van Eyck, and this is the wedding portrait on the left. And if you think of us, we all have our wedding portraits, but this is what was happening at this time in Holland and in Belgium. First of all, Holland broke away from Spain in the 1600s, so they became a secular country. They had been a Christian country, whereas Belgium stayed under the auspices of Spain, Isabella and Ferdinand. So here you have, everyone says she's pregnant. I don't think she is. I think it's the style of her dress. But these are realistic people that wanted to have their wedding portrait done. And there's a lot of symbolism in this. If you look around, you've got the dog, which is the symbol of loyalty. The shoes are off, which is always a symbol of holy ground. You have one candle lighted, which means she's a virgin. And it's all planned. And she's pulling up her dress, which I think was the fashion of the day. But they're very realistic, ordinary people, except at this point, the Dutch and the Flemish were making lots of money in export-import. And Hans Memling, this was done in Bruges, and we don't know who it is. It's an unknown gentleman praying, but look at the background, and everyone's set into a setting, and it's a beautiful, serious, dignified portrait of a young man. Okay, now let me get to the... Okay, then Hans Holbein, who was German, he was hired as the court painter in England. And this is good old Thomas More, and he shows him with great wisdom, great dignity, very pensive, isn't he? But there's a little fear in him. You can feel a tension in him. Because what was happening? Henri was on to his second wife, wanted to leave the church. And what did Henri do to Thomas More? He killed him. And I think he really got, this is this ruffian here, vulgar man, who's standing there like, look at me, and aren't I wonderful? And he doesn't look too great, but he is what he is, right? But he captured him as he is. And then Rubens, of course, went to Italy and studied and saw Michelangelo. And this is Rubens with his wife and child. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful painting. And I wanted to make you laugh a little bit on this one here. Oh, not that one, excuse me. On the right. This is Marie de Medici studying, being educated. And it's done by Rubens. He also did a series of Marie de Medici in the palaces. In fact, it's down in Sarasota in the Ringling Brothers Museum is where it's been transported. But I thought this was rather cute because it's just the same old Marie de Medici in all her daily life. This is Marie de Medici. That's Mercury. This is Apollo with music. And we have to bring in this classical. These are the three graces that were painted a lot during the classical period. Now, getting back to Van Dyck, because Van Dyck was very influential on American art. He set a style for aristocrats and for the nobility, and he was hired by by James, and then Charles I as the court painter. And if you go over to Windsor Castle and go through there, you're going to see millions of Van Dyck portraits of different English aristocrats. But this is a beautiful painting of, look how Charles and his wife and child, are those in focus? Maybe it's my eyes. But they're set in this beautiful Roman setting with the beautiful cloth and the landscape in London in the background. And look at the textures on their clothes. And he set this nobility type of thing. Look at the Marquesa. Look at his hands. When I had a professor who said, always look at Van Dyck's hands because they tell you a great deal about the person. And she's very much a beautiful queen almost, and her hands are beautiful and dainty and dignified. And she's very delicate, and it's all there. And Frans Hals was Dutch, and they have a museum outside of Amsterdam, and the name is, I can't remember it right now. But anyways, he wanted to show the middle class, and this is the Merry Drinker. And they also, in Holland, had these great community groups where they would, St. George, they had different things. And this is the civic officers. And each one sat for their portrait when this was done. It's almost a different style than this is very loose, that's much more tight. And then I had to show you Vermeer, because we all know the girl with the pearl earring. And I wanted to compare her with Rembrandt's Old Man. I thought Rembrandt got to the soul, he got to the person. And I just was looking at this the other day, I'm thinking, she looks a little frightened to me. Maybe she was frightened. She was up in the attic with Vermeer, and the wife was downstairs, and he had stolen her pearl earring, so maybe. But it's very abstract, but he's also, notice the chiaroscuro, which they both use. The light is coming in from the left, and the same thing with the man, and it sort of brings out their character and their features. I think this Old Man is just a beautiful painting, just a beautiful painting. But notice we're doing ordinary people now. We're not doing kings, queens, Caesar. And then I wanted to start with, show you some English, because most of the English artists influenced the Americans. And I have a quote, which if I can get to it, but I'll just tell you what it said. It's by a historian who said, wherever the English go, they bring their horses, they bring their law, and they bring their portraiture. And so, he was, and you can, this is Hogarth, who was a very good English artist, and Gainsborough, who also did landscapes. But these are beautiful, and because Van Dyck was in England, that he did influence the English artists as well. Okay, and here's Van Dyck here. You can look at the beautiful hands and the beautiful woman with the pillar. And this is John Singleton Copley, our first great American portrait artist. And this is Mrs. Boylston from Boston. And we are now getting quite wealthy in the colonies. We have independence now. And Copley learned from his uncle, who had a print shop in Boston. He never saw an original painting. He just looked at prints. And he must have seen Van Dyck. It wouldn't have been in color, I don't think. But look at the way he does textures. And look at her hands. And look at the turn of the face. You can see the influence, can't you? But what was happening in our country? Our country had won the war, and the people in Boston they're buying English decorative arts, they were buying English rugs, they were buying anything English to decorate their homes. And of course, the very wealthy Americans wanted to also have paintings done that were in the English style. And then Benjamin West, who was also a portrait artist, but left for England when he was 22 and became George III's favorite artist. But this was done for one of George III's chapel, Daniel interpreting the Old Testament. And he preferred to do biblical or historical paintings. Also, John Trumbull, who was another wonderful American artist. At this point, we have the Declaration of Independence. This is a wonderful painting to see. Here's George. Here's John Adams. There's Thomas Jefferson. There's Ben Franklin. I'm assuming that's Madison signing the Declaration of Independence. But these people sat again for the portraits, and so these are the portraits of these people. Now, I want to go back a little bit. When the first Puritans, Quakers, came to this country, none of them, they were anti-monarch. They didn't have churches. The churches were very plain. They were not used to seeing art. They hadn't lived with art. So there was very little art. The first artists who came along were Copley and Smyber. But what was happening out of the cities? Out of the cities, if you were a wealthy merchant or a good farmer, and you wanted to have your wife's portrait done, or your son or your daughter, Ammi Phillips was an itinerant painter, or you could call him a folk artist, and he painted in the Berkshires quite a bit, actually. This is Mrs. Myers, and what he did is, look how abstract this, oh, it's wrong button. She's very flat, so is the daughter, and she's not even really sitting on her lap. And the story is, he would leave the face out, and then when he got to the farm, he put in the face of whoever the portrait was being done. And then this is John Smybert, who was in Boston, and he was from England, and he was a second-rate artist. And if you look at him and then look at Copley, but there was a demand for portraits, so he knew where the market was. And then Joseph Blackburn was also from England, and I love this because I always think this looks like they have masks on their faces. But, this is a prominent family in Boston, and that's what he did. And here's John Trumbull, and we all love Alexander Hamilton, especially if you've written the book about him and seen the play. He was quite a handsome man, actually, but he was important. He was the Secretary of the Treasury, and he was a very ambitious guy, and John Trumbull must have seen the writing on the wall, because this is a very beautiful portrait. It really gets to his soul. You can feel his personality there, in his ambition, his aspirations. And of course, Gilbert Stuart, who was the one that did George. This is a wonderful painting of Thomas Jefferson, too. It's timeless. It shows his dignity, his wisdom. You notice how the light comes onto his forehead. And then Charles Willson Peale he lived in Philadelphia. He's named his children Rembrandt, Raphael, Angelica Kaufman. And Rembrandt did quite a few portraits of George Washington. But now, I can't go on without saying that we have to notice and that we have a lot of portraits in our history of people who are really no longer with us or have the power and the dignity that they once had. And George Catlin lived in Philadelphia. He had been at West Point. He saw this contingent of Indians coming into this building in Philadelphia. He knew, because of Manifest Destiny and the going the expansion out west, that the Indians would not last too long. He knew it. And he said, I'm going to devote the rest of my life to recording these people because I know that they will soon be gone. And there's a book on him where he says that. And these are absolutely beautiful paintings by Catlin. Look at he showed their beautiful dress, their dignity. He shows them as kings. Well, a lot of them were down at the Smithsonian. They had a show down there a couple years ago. The originals are down there. And I wanted to show the Civil War, which is certainly part of our history. Now, also, I want to talk about photography. Photography in 1840 was a lot of the artists who went out west with the Western artists also took photos, and then like Timothy O'Sullivan here on the left would often work with an artist. He would do a scene, and then the artist would do a scene, and they would influence each other. But I thought this Battle of Gettysburg, this poor man, obviously after the battle, but look at the crutches in his foot. I mean, there's not much left of this person. And of course, everyone had their portrait done, and this is General Twiggs by Matthew Brady. So that's a part of our history. And then Thomas Eakins, which I think is one of the very best artists, was from Philadelphia. He taught, and I think this portrait of his wife is just so psychological. I mean, she looks like the long-lasting wife. I mean, there's a sadness in her eyes and a weariness. And this man was working all the time, and she was probably home alone. I don't know, but he certainly gets the character and the personality. Mrs. Van Buren is quite bored with life, and we are sitting there with our arm and our fan. She's got a beautiful dress on, but he's really a wonderful, wonderful, insightful artist, and he's a wonderful portrait artist. Now, I have to tell you, this was a special moment for me. Last Thursday, my husband and I went down to New York to see the Henry James exhibit at the Morgan Library. I suggest you all go down. I learned so much. Of course, Henry James was a very good friend of Edith Wharton's, and they both wrote of their time, the Gilded Age, the people, the women who were sold off to aristocrats in France or England or Italy because of their money. And he grew up with John Singer Sargent. Their parents dragged them around Europe when they were children, so they were good friends. And this is a portrait by Sargent of Henry James. And I went to a talk in El Tadi yesterday at the Mount, and he was there and knew all these artists that lived there and painted, and he wrote The Golden Bowl. He wrote, The Portrait of a Lady. He wrote all these psychological stories of the Gilded Age and of the people, and Sargent did too. This is Lady Agnew on the right by Sargent. And you can see where Van Dyck has influenced a lot of these portrait artists, but she's beautiful, and it's the beautiful paintings, the textures, and you get a psychological insight into her as well. And this is, these are two paintings by Whistler. Whistler on the left and Sargent on the right. Society was changing. The immigrants had come in. There was a lot of people. And Asher Wertheimer, and there still is a Wertheimer firm, I believe, was a very, very fabulous Jewish entrepreneur. And he could afford to have his portrait done. So this tells you a lot about what was happening in our society. And then Theodore Duret, this is by Whistler, who liked to work in black and white and grays, called them compositions like music. But he captures the elegance when you go out with your tie, your tux on, and your cape and so forth. He captures the time of the Gilded Age. And when we were down in New York, I thought about, and you look at the Morgan Library, you go over to the public library, what beautiful Renaissance buildings they are, and how elegant life was during this time. And sculpture was being done. And I went up to the third floor of the public library last week, and there's dozens of portraits, American portraits, of all the wealthy donors who gave to the public library. And you would never even know they were up there. It was wonderful. But if you have a chance, it's just wonderful to see, and I really have to read this quote to you. I have to find it, if you'll be with me, that I took it from a label. at the exhibit last week. Let me just show it to you. Let's see, what did he say here? I can't find it. What he says is that artists and writers are the same because they're both looking at the same scene, they're both looking at psychologically, and they are successful. And he felt a very close affinity to artists, and he felt they gave him more insight into his writing because and he was talking about Sargent and so forth. Okay, and I had to bring in Daniel Chester French because a lot of sculpture was being done in New York and elsewhere. And I wanted to show, as we all know this, Daniel Chester French, this magnificent sculpture of Abraham Lincoln. And if you've ever been down there at night, this is all lighted, so you just get this fabulous image of him. And on the right-hand side is the Vietnam Memorial, which is lighted with all the names. It's a very moving experience. And this is a photograph by Matthew Gardner, and this is a real Abe, weary from war, weary from war. And then I wanted to talk, this is Juliette Cameron. She was an English photographer, and she really influenced American photography. She did Tennyson and Darwin and Longfellow, and she wanted to get into their psychological mind, and she certainly does with Tennyson here. And Alfred Stieglitz was the first modern gallery for the modern artist, cubist and abstract, in New York City, and he was married to Georgia O'Keeffe. And this is a photograph he did from her, and it is quite interesting, isn't it? Very quite interesting. And he really captures her as well. And then as the immigrants were coming in, we have the Ashcan school, and they wanted to relate the common man in this country. And the left, Henri, he really pronounced his name, Henri, is Cafferty, and he's a little Irish immigrant boy. And John Sloan on the right, these are women drying their hair on the top of the apartment building. And John Sloan really was a socialist, and he wrote about it, and they really wanted to help the common man, both of them. And it documents a very important period of our history. And then we get into Cubism, and I wanted to show these two because when Picasso in 1914 with Braque started Cubism, it was very influenced by science, because the theory of absolute, which you saw in the Renaissance paintings where everything is never going to change, Picasso said, we have a theory of relativity. Nothing is absolute, everything is changing all the time. So this painting is up at the Clark right now. It's Dora Maar, one of his girlfriends or wives, I'm not sure which. And what the theory is with Picasso is if I look at Pat over there, I can see her side of her face at one point, but if I look at her this way, I can see the front of her face. And so he was showing that when we look at something, we see it in different perspectives. So everything is always changing. And she doesn't look too good, does she? But anyways, this is one of my favorite paintings by Klimt. It was done in Vienna, very wealthy Jewish family, but you can see the influence of Cubism in her beautiful golden dress. It's just a wonderful, Adele was her name, and beautiful. And then I wanted to show, these are American artists. We have the Cubists and we have the Regionalists. And this is Martin Hartley, and that's called A German Soldier. Can you see that? It's Cubism, and he's just taken all the colors from this German soldier and broken it up. And then, of course, Grant Wood. This is Nan with her plant. It's a beautiful painting of the Midwest and the West. And then Basquiat is still with us, and I call him a street artist, but he was really big in the galleries about 10 years ago. And these are called the Philistines. And I don't know what they are, but they're people. And then, of course, Andrew Wyeth. Helga, which is just a beautiful portrait. I just finished a book called Christina's World, and it tells all about that family that Wyeth knew very, very well, and how he would go over every day, and the brother and Christina would pose for him, and how attached he became to them. And he's got tremendous psychological insight into his portraits. And then we're back here at the Rockwell, and here's Jackie, and here's Warhol. Now, Norman Rockwell did the one on the left, which is a beautiful, sweet portrait of Jackie. I don't know if she was that sweet, but that's how he predicts her. And then, of course, Warhol wants to take someone who's famous at the most dramatic moment of their life, just like he did Marilyn Monroe up there, and show the tragedy of Jackie Kennedy after her husband was shot. Now, this is real. This is a real, I think he modeled from her, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not sure. But it's a realistic, he always had a model where Warhol always worked from photographs. And then I thought these two were connected anyways, so I thought I'd put them together. There's John Kennedy, which is a very dignified, beautiful portrait of him. Makes him look pretty good. And then there's Marilyn with her eyeshadow and her kissy mouth, to see that this is a celebrity and this was a president. And then I wanted to end with this wonderful Rockwell, because we need these 4 freedoms so badly today. Rockwell is really coming up in the world. Warhol was the top guy, but I think Rockwell's going to overcome him because we need so much of what he says in his paintings. And this is part of the 4 freedoms, which are over there. This is freedom of speech, and it was done probably in Stockbridge. I'm not sure where it was done, or it could have been in Vermont, but he took a live model and look at his face. I mean, it's wonderful. The pride of being able to get up and speak, how sincere he was, and I thought I'd put it with Warhol's Mao. There's no expression there at all. He just looks like an egotistical man. What it has to look at is what Rockwell says in his paintings. Visually and mentally, they affect us because that's who we think we are, and that's what we want to be, is like him. And I wanted to end with, here's the thing on Henry James. Do you mind if I read it to you? He says, I took this from a label. The analogy between the art of the painter and the art of the novel is, as far as I am able to see, complete. The inspiration is the same, their process is the same, and their success is the same. They learn from each other. The cause is the same, and they honor one another. And James felt that art was the center of his life. And I also wanted to ask you, and you just think, you don't have to answer me, but what do Andy Warhol's portraits represent about our culture when they were done? How are they created? Who are they? And where are they shown? And then what do Rockwell's portraits promote in our visual and subconscious mind? And why are they so necessary today? And I wanted to end with John Walker, who wrote this wonderful book on portraiture. He said, we don't know what the future brings. We don't know what innovations will evolve. But we do know that the analysis of character will remain. The artist's search for the essential human being, advances in psychology, which have disclosed the workings of the brain, will be of immense assistance. And William Butler Yeats said, so long as man can breathe, or eyes can see, so long lives this, he's talking about portraits, and this gives life to thee. And that's William Butler Yeats. So I got through that pretty good, didn't I? Thank you.